I think the reason why it's interesting to call the EU a project with no name is because there's never been a self-conscious acknowledgement by the advocates of the European Union and before that the EEC of what the project of European unification is really all about. I think if you look back over the last 40 or 50 years, you'll find that there's been many, many attempts to find some kind of coherence to the whole sort of business. It almost implied that there was a very clear plan at the outset by people like Schuman and Monnet, which was then gradually carried out either by stealth or openly in one form or another. But as one thing I want to sort of argue is that in fact the whole evolution of the project of European unification has had a number of different aspects to it that has really sort of evolved more or less in a way that wasn't necessarily the way it was intended, and that in many respects one of the interesting things about the European project is that it cannot really have a name to it for the very simple reason that it's never been able to generate a positive form of validation for itself. And in fact, as I go on to argue towards the end, the interesting aspect about the narrative that the European Union has set out to construct for itself is entirely based upon negative forms of validation. In other words, it always has relied on the fact that it isn't as bad or it isn't as problematic as what the alternative is. And I think that element, that negative form of validation, has really come to the fore in the current climate. Because I think in many respects it's interesting that if you look at the global press, what's often referred to by people I don't agree with as the neoliberal media, what they often sort of argue now is that the Brexit vote represents a body blow to the liberal world order. And the assumption is that there is liberalism, which is associated with the European Union, and then there are the forces of illiberalism, which are the alternatives. So there's an interesting article in Foreign Policy a couple of weeks ago, which is entitled, "Liberalism Isn't Working." And basically, what they do is they evoke an image of a world order that's crumbling under the impact of hordes of illiberal Brexiteers who are internationally almost coordinating their action. And this is what the author said basically, I wonder if the West is sleepwalking toward illiberal democracy. The ideology championed by Hungary's Viktor Orban, emulated by Poland's Law and Justice, and implicitly endorsed by Trump and many of the Brexiteers, yeah. There's almost like an international alliance of illiberal reactionaries who by definition are of the same moral order, so that if you voted for Brexit, then automatically you'd be voting for Trump, and by definition you'd be supporting the Polish government's attacks on abortion rights and various other things that are going on. That's the kind of network that's been established. And basically, what the argument is that they put forward is that, by definition, if you actually challenge the European Union, you criticize the European Union, and if you attack it, that's more or less the functional equivalent of the attacks that illiberal forces made against democratic institutions in the interwar era. And time again, the metaphor of the interwar era and what happened at that point is continually brought into play in relation to the debate on the European Union. And I think that's not accidental, because that's more or less what has been the case beforehand. And often this threat of illiberalism, this powerful force of illiberalism, is conveyed in a dramatic tone, which basically concludes with the very illiberal assumption that those who defy the authority of the EU are by definition are the enemy. It's almost like a sort of a old fascist theory revived in a liberal form. Either you're with us or you're against us. I mean, there is almost nothing that exists in between. So for example, Donald Tusk, the glamorous president of the European Council, basically characterized Poland's arguments recently with the EU by saying that they have different values, different strategic aims to those of liberal democracy. And he ends, and he concludes by the statement, whoever attacks the European Union harms America, and whoever undermines the foundation of liberal democracy harms one another. So in other words, there's a kind of black and white sense of, sort of any attacks on the EU is not really permitted. The impermissibility of defining the values of the EU has become totally integral to the rhetorical and political strategy of European unifiers. And I think that's been more or less the case since the 1970s, that it is really a bastion of liberalism that stands against the bad old days of the 1930s and of Nazi Germany. And one of the key arguments that supporters of the EU use to justify their existence is to assert that those who question the project of European unification are the contemporary equivalents of the xenophobic and racist extremists who were responsible for plunging the continent into 2 world wars in the 20th century. If you go to the European Museum that's in Brussels and other European institutions, the story they tell is that Europe had lost its soul in the First World War and the Second World War. We kind of unraveled as a civilization. That's the bad old days. But then that was rescued when the European Unification project was launched in the early 50s. So there's a kind of before and after. It's a kind of year zero history. That good history really begins with European unification, and everything before that are the bad old days. And that's a very important almost epistemological position that's being held. It's very opposite to the way that nations and empires are founded. Usually nations and empires are founded on the basis of a myth of a positive development. The founding is a positive, glorious moment, the kind of the golden age moment on which you build this new sort of institution. In the case of the European Union, it's the very opposite. It's really the break from the bad old days that you want to talk about. The precursor of the European Union is all bad. Europe is losing its soul, but now we've learned the dramatic lessons of the interwar period. We learned what happened, in the Second World War, and we're regaining our soul by not being like that. So from this standpoint, people who actually contest the EU are not considered to be legitimate debating partners. I think that's really very important to realize. I mean, at first I can understand from the reactions after the Brexit why it was so extreme. But from their point of view, the position of criticizing Brexit is an illegitimate, by definition, is an illegitimate point of view. It is basically like having a discussion on the finer points of Jewish theology with Adolf Hitler. I mean, that's more or less, how the whole sort of discussion is kind of seen and understood. And in a sense, skepticism about running the EU has been branded as Euroscepticism. And as far as Brussels is concerned, like 1930s fascism, it constitutes a direct threat to peace and stability in this negative idealization of what it's really all about. So in a speech delivered to a Berlin audience in November 2010 by Herman Van Rompuy, he's not a football player, but the president of the European Council, he argued very clearly that Euroscepticism leads to war. So you begin by being skeptical of Europe, that's the beginning of the continuum, and that actually leads to war. And he ends his speech by saying, we have to fight the danger of the new Euroscepticism. Now, it's an interesting use of the word, because when he talks about the new Euroscepticism, you're entitled to ask the question, what is the old Euroscepticism? And of course, there is no such thing as the old Euroscepticism, because the term only began to be used in the 1970s. But what he's really referring to are the Nazis and the fascists and all the authoritarian bad people that existed kind of previously. The claim that Euroscepticism leads to war, or at least an incitement to war, is very much linked to the assertion, a position that underpins a lot of the documents and a lot of the philosophical outlooks of the European Union, which basically sees the problem as being that of nationalism or national sovereignty. Not just popular sovereignty, but national sovereignty, because the way they present national sovereignty, or even the ideal of a nation state, is that nationalism is seen as not just simply patriotism, it's not just simply seen as an affiliation with a particular nation. It's interpreted by them as really the first step towards war, or the first step towards aggressive nationalism, which then becomes the lead into war, which in some cases goes a step further and leads to kind of genocide. So there's a kind of idea that nationalism is dangerous, and as one Rompuy says, a national sovereignty is a lie. Right? In their eyes, the idea of national sovereignty is that one of the reasons why people in the Remain camp often made the point how absurd the idea of taking control is. It's something that they made time and time again. Is because as far as they, and they really do believe this, they think that national sovereignty is a complete lie. It's a myth. And the reason why it's a myth is because we live in this incredibly globalized world where you cannot really control anything of importance within your own national boundaries. And the pretense that somehow you can take control is really an attempt to kind of go back to the 14th century, sort of in a small feudal kind of setting, rather than something that has any kind of real meaning. So basically, I think that kind of condemnation of nationalism, condemnation of Euroscepticism, condemnation of any serious opposition to the EU has really become very important in the way that politics in the nation state plays itself out. So at the risk of simplification, what has occurred is that the self-conscious process of defining the EU as an institution that's opposed to nationalism has over the years drawn the left towards it and turned sections of the right against the nation state. I think that was an inevitable process because historically a lot of the right were more European unity than the left was. There was all kinds of changes occurring. But what has occurred over the last few decades is that because nationalism is seen as the nation over there, and the EU is seen as the opposite of nationalism, something that's above that, the left and the right has polarized around that distinction. So in this polarized landscape, any criticism of substance that is directed against the EU is seen by definition as something that needs to be marginalized, and that's the basic consensus. A very interesting study was carried out by a social anthropologist called Marion MacDonald from Cambridge, who basically did fieldwork, ethnographic fieldwork in Brussels, going into the institutions where these European politicians operated, where the more influential commissioners and their bureaucratic sort of cronies were hanging out. And one of the interesting conclusions that she came up with, and she is not by any means, sort of a Eurosceptic, but one of the interesting things that comes out of her fieldwork, and she makes this point very clearly herself, is that within the confines of Brussels, any serious criticism of the EU was impermissible. You simply couldn't make any criticisms of substance in that kind of setting. And they basically said that if you criticize the European Union, you were automatically assumed to be some kind of right-wing extremist. And there was no nuanced distinction between the right-wing extremist who criticizes the EU and everybody else on the other side. And she writes this, just to read out her observation. She says, since the 1970s especially, it has become increasingly difficult in Europe to criticize the EU without appearing to be some lunatic right-wing fascist, racist, or nationalist, the one allying with the other, or simply the parochial idiot of Little Britain. The serious side of this, she says, is that the EU has quite literally encouraged neo-nationalist racism in Europe. That has often been the only space available within which the EU has been possible, criticism of the EU has been possible. And she concludes by saying a new space of serious criticism is therefore badly needed. I think the reaction to Brexit really proves what MacDonald noted in her observations, which is that within the EU confines, where criticism isn't really possible of the EU, it's automatically labeled as being populist, right-wing, xenophobic, or a variation thereof. There is no space for debate. I mean, that's the really interesting thing. It is impossible to have a serious debate because with so much at stake, if indeed the critics of the EU are such bad people and represent such an incredible threat to democracy and the liberal way of life, it isn't possible to have a serious debate because, you know, if indeed the stakes are really as high as all that, then it's almost like an incitement to arms to defend the liberal way of life. I mean, you know, that's all you can possibly do. And I think that one of the interesting things that comes out of this development is that in many respects you could argue that the recent emergence and strength of right-wing, xenophobic, populist movements within Europe, and they do exist, you know, sort of some are more sort of right-wing and more racist than others, is actually the outcome of the way that the EU has set about marginalizing criticism. Because one of my conclusions, the conclusion that I come to, particularly in my work in East Europe, is that if you have a situation where the criticism of the EU is automatically labeled as illegitimate, where you cannot make these statements if you are in the mainstream of society, you can only make extremely mild, very hesitant points against the EU, but you can't make any serious criticism, then what happens is all the sort of reservations and all the anger and all the reaction to the EU that normal people have will be automatically channeled into the only groups and into the only people that are prepared to give that a voice. And I think that if you look around Europe and you'll see the rise of various kinds of movements who are Eurosceptical, I think that in many respects the fact that they have certain kind of right-wing racist affiliations, by no means all of them, means that you know, sort of they have become the children, you know, sort of the unintended offspring of the European Union itself. So if anybody is to blame for that, it is them and the kind of politics of marginalization that they've been involved in all of this time. I think it's important to realize, if we go back and look at the history of the European Union, is that it's always been uncomfortable with democracy. Sometimes in the recent months I've been told, you know, Frank, why don't you try to go and reform the European Union? That seemed like a sensible option. The trouble with that strategy is that the European Union was set up explicitly to be insulated from democracy, to be, in a sense, distant from popular pressure. The European Union was established precisely to protect the political elites within European society from having to be accountable to the citizens, to the electorate. And the idea that somehow this highly constrained form of democracy can somehow be reformed is really unthinkable, because it would have to be kind of almost like a work of starting from scratch and almost beginning from the beginning. So I think that's something that is really important to sort of bear in mind, because one of the things that is important about the European Union that is often not kind of taken into account is that it did set about, it didn't have a clear project with a name, but the one point that they all agreed on was absolutely essential was that the issue of national sovereignty had to be depoliticized. You couldn't actually get rid of national sovereignty, you could not get rid of the nation state or national affiliation, but everything to do with the nation had to be depoliticized in order to legitimate what Europe was going to be about. And that's the reason why you'll find that the European Union has always been, sort of apparently progressive in its dismissal of borders. Open borders are, always been quite important in terms of its rhetoric. I think the reason why it's always been so casual and cavalier with the question of borders is because it was its approach, its understanding of the way in which the idea of national sovereignty could be diminished and its content, its real meaning, sort of could be lost. So in many ways, I think the argument that the European Union has been using, that borders are no good, they're pretty meaningless anyway, because we live in a globalized world. So why fetishize those kinds of borders? It's part and parcel of this apology that has evolved in slightly different forms over a period of time. Now, in the context of the Cold War and relative economic security of the post-war boom, European unification never faced any challenge. I mean, European unification was pretty much unquestioned throughout the 50s, throughout most of the 60s. And I think it's only when the Cold War comes to an end, and it's when economic prosperity gradually unravels, that the European Union is forced to begin to look around and ask, well, now that we haven't got the stable environment within which we operate, what are we going to do? How are we going to justify our our existence? And one of the things that occurs from 1973 onwards, when the post-war boom more or less ends, and then it becomes even more explicit after the Cold War, is this desperate attempt by the European Union to create a narrative for itself. And that's really what I want to spend a bit of time on what's left. Because part and parcel of this narrative is to compensate for the fact that neither the Cold War nor economic prosperity can be relied upon to provide some kind of validation for the European Union. In an interesting document published in 2013 called New Narrative for Europe, and it's interesting how self-conscious they are, a new narrative for Europe, as if somehow, we'll kind of concoct a story, a new narrative for Europe. And the new narrative of Europe was also published alongside another publication called Mind and Body of Europe, a new narrative. And one of the stories that this new narrative says is that, yes, the Cold War has ended, the post-war boom is no longer able to provide us with the intellectual and legitimating resources. And this is how they explain it, the new problem. In recent years, the experiences of war, of totalitarian regimes, the Cold War have generally lost their immediacy in the eyes of the general public, which is to say that those horrors are losing their legitimizing force. Interesting expression. The legitimacy derives from the horrors of the past. I mean, it's something that is there in almost everything that they write. So, and what they're really saying, oh shit, it's really bad, because those horrors are no longer, have the capacity to legitimize it, because people are forgetting what it was like in the bad old days of the interwar period and Second World War. So they're losing their legitimizing force, and they say more and more Europeans regard the experience of the 20th century, rightly or wrongly, as a thing of the past. Well, of course they are a thing of the past. if you're living in 2013, unless you have some kind of senility problem or whatever, it is very much a thing of the past. And then you go on to say the alarming results of this, and the most recent elections in Europe prove this trend, is that 25% of the European electorate voted for extremist and anti-European parties. It's the same, anti-European extremists are the same, which shows that they must have forgotten, and forgotten is underlined, the reasons for which the European Union was built. This presents a particular challenge for a new narrative for future European integration. It needs to give heart and soul to Europe and help prevent people from repeating the mistakes of the past, as citizens are increasingly swayed by dangerous populist rabble-rousers. So the scenario that's presented is that people have forgotten the interwar period. They forgot what the Second World War was about because the Cold War has come to end and the world has really changed. And now there's a danger that you're going to have a rerun of what happened in the 1930s. And the danger is shown by the fact that 25% of the people are unhappy with Europe. And in their eyes, if 25% of the people are against Europe, those 25% are like, potential brown shirt purchasers, sort of, and are going to go out of the street. And Kristallnacht is just around the corner. At the time when this report was published, Jose Manuel Durado Barroso, he's also not a football player, but the president of the European Commission, argued that the era of passive acquiescence, or what he called implicit consent, had to be replaced by a more open engagement with public life. And I think his use of the word implicit consent is quite accurate. Because what he's really getting at is until this point, until today, the population of Europe has only given a passive or an implicit consent. Nobody has given an active consent to the European Union. That has never been gained. That has never been achieved. He says now that's come to an end. And he informed his audience when this report was published, he made the following point. He said, "We are at a point in time when European integration must be pursued openly, transparently, and with the explicit support of the citizens of Europe." In other words, he's actually admitting that up till this point, it wasn't that transparent, it wasn't that open in the way that the EU project was pursued. And he says, the times of European integration by implicit consent of citizens are over. Right? So we can no longer rely upon implicit consent. Europe has to be ever more democratic. Europe's democratic legitimacy and accountability must keep pace with its increased role and power. That's it's a completely unobjectionable statement. He's basically saying Europe now needs to find a new form of consent for its project of unification. And that's basically the problem that the European Union set out for itself. But how do you get consent? Well, the way you get consent in the European context is by relying, very much relying, upon public relations, upon developing new stories, upon developing new narratives. It also depends upon this, what Europe has been doing since the 1970s, since the economic recession, is moving into areas such as culture and education in order to forge and to create a new Europe. It's particularly targeted young Europeans who it sees as being much more open to the European ideals, that they're more nationalist kind of parents. And one of the key issues that the European Union ideologues are struggling with is what is the content of this new narrative? What are you actually going to say that Europe is all about? How much time will I get left?
Oh, about 10, 15 minutes.
The key problem that they've been struggling with for the last 15, 20 years is the recognition that economics is not enough. One of the arguments that the European Union used in the past is that because of the relative economic prosperity of a strong European bloc, that by itself attracts attracts acquiescence and support. And I think one of the key problems has been is that since 1973 there's been a number of economic recessions, each of which is then followed by an outburst of Euroscepticism, each of which then leads to an attempt to construct a narrative which attempts to take Europe behind economics, behind relying upon economic developments. And in more recently, especially after the recession in 2008, which has been a critically important point for trying to find a new way of giving this project without a name, there's been a much greater attempt to develop that narrative. In a report published after the recession, they make the point in the following ways. It says, it's no coincidence that economic integration is not enough to drive European political reform. Economic integration simply does not of itself lead to political integration, because markets cannot produce politically resilient solidarity. And they conclude by saying that the original expectation that the political unity of the EU would be the consequence of an economic common market has proven to be illusory. And this point was most prettily expressed by Jacques Delors, we all know, who's also not a football player, but used to be the former president of the European Commission, when in his novel stated, "Nobody falls in love with a growth rate." I think that, which I think really does sum up this notion, this instrumental notion, that as long as economically we're doing well, the problem of legitimacy can be very easily bypassed. I want to spend my last few minutes, last 5 or 6 minutes, looking at the evolution of the narrative. Until 1973, which is roughly when the oil crisis kicked in, if you looked at the discussions in the EU and the documents, you could by and large say it's a future-oriented movement. It's a future-oriented movement in the sense that it's a project that's trying to achieve something. And it's very much making promises, implicitly and explicitly, about what Europe is going to become. Sometimes it even has a slightly utopian kind of quality to it. This is what Europe is going to be like. After 1973, but particularly after the 1980s, if you look at Europe, it becomes increasingly a project that is focused on the past. It's very much trying to develop an identity for itself that is not about future transformation, but is basically trying to find an identity. And almost all the documents and all the discussions are about the question of what is a European identity? Where do we get this European identity from? And there are big discussions going on about which bit of European history you can take on board as the constitutive elements of what Europe is going to be about. How are you going to present the European past? And in that discussion and debate, what becomes very, very clear is that Europe is really born not out of Greek civilization, not out of the Roman imperial experience, not out of Christian medieval Europe, but Europe is the child of fascism and the Second World War. That's basically it. And the identity of Europe, in a moral sense, evolves as almost constituting a contrast, a moral contrast with the bad old days, or what occurred at that particular point in time. Now this has got some very interesting aspects of it. It's absolutely fascinating because, if you look at the discussions around European unification in the 1950s, when it more or less takes off, all the way to the 1960s, there's a lot of discussion about the destructive consequences of the Second World War. I mean, a lot of discussion about how Europe was divided, how European stability couldn't be guaranteed, how we had to find a way of creating a world where German aggression and French, defensiveness could be balanced out. So that's a big discussion. But the one thing that you don't hear about in the 1950s and 1960s is the Holocaust. Almost never mentioned, right? I mean, the Jews are conspicuous by their silence at that particular stage in time. It's all about, sort of the war and peace, and that's all there is to it. However, suddenly, in the 1980s, beginning of the 1980s, and especially as you get to the 1990s, the Holocaust emerges as the central trope around which the identity of Europe, or the moral rehabilitation of Europe, as somehow morally superior to the bad old days that have occurred in the past, really begins to kick in. And it's at this point in time in the 1990s that literally every single city in Europe all of a sudden kind of has a Holocaust museum, or is about to build one. This is a time when you have, sort of all kinds of educational initiatives about never again. When every child are bored out of their skulls are taken to a the nearest concentration camp, near their school. This is the time when, you have a situation where it does become a veritable industry, where you have the beginnings of discussion about hate laws, about Holocaust denial. And when you look at, when you actually carefully look at the documents, what you have is the appropriation of the Holocaust as a founding myth. It's not the Holocaust where real people died in gas chamber and had all those terrible things happen. So it becomes a symbol, a myth that is then appropriated and becomes the key element in the discussion, and becomes an unquestioned, sort of trope. Now, what's very interesting, I haven't got time to go into it, is that the Holocaust as a symbol, had a lot of promise, a lot of potential. I mean, who's going to be for the Holocaust in the 21st century? Except two things happened very quickly. The first thing that happened is that Israel kicked in, and Israel gave everybody permission not to be just anti-Zionist, but on a bad day also be a little bit anti-Jewish. So anti-Semitism begins to take off. And what also happens is that with the accession of the East European states, with Hungary, Romania, Poland coming in, you have a situation where these guys are saying, well, it's all very well for you to say that the Holocaust is your founding myth, but for us, our big problem, the big crimes that we experienced was that of Stalinism, right? And therefore what you have within the confines of the EU is a debate opening of a debate that, for lack of a better expression, you could call the Gulag versus the Shoah. Which is the worst crime, which is the worst problem. And what it leads to is a kind of competition over the founding myth, the founding identity of what it is that Europe should really be kind of based on. And I think as a result of that, in the very attempt to create this narrative and identity, the only way that you could possibly resolve it is by not going too far in promoting the myth of foundation, but instead opting for a continuation of the negative validation of the European Union, which is to pathologize any criticism, which is to associate any critics of the EU as being illiberal, and which is ultimately to close down debate upon Europe altogether. And that's the world that we live in today, where gradually, it's only a matter of time before criticizing the European Union will become a mild form of a hate crime, where it almost will be seen as an incitement to war, in the way that criticizing Muslims is seen as an incitement to religious hatred. So it's an interesting kind of development, and it indicates that at every single stage, the meaning of the European Union has altered and changed, mainly because of its quest for legitimation, this elusive quest for legitimation, which can never be sort of realized for the very simple reason that there's no possibility of the European Union actually forging a narrative for itself in anything other than an administrative manner.